It was a big anti-Semitic issue between those who were non-Jewish planners and those who were Jewish planners. And since I'm the 7th generation of a Jewish planner, I thought I'd introduce that to you.
And she does a lot of wonderful work, kind of mixing Jewish and African American heritage in a lot of her artwork, so many of you will want to come to that in April. So we already had a little bit of a late start, so I don't want to delay us any further, but please stay for a great discussion after the lectures as well.
Thank you, thank you. Do you, if I talk nice and loud, can you all hear me, especially if I talk from here? Does that work for everybody in the back? Okay, great. So my ambition in the 20 or 25 minutes that I have allotted to me is to try to give us a little bit of a background, a little overview on the relationship between Jews and blacks in the United States of America, actually even before the United States becomes a republic. And the reason I like to do that to begin with is that very often, if people know there was a connection between the Jewish community and the black community, they basically think about, if they know anything at all, usually the civil rights period. If they know a little more than that, they may know that there were some interactions between Jews and blacks in certain urban areas. But very often the whole story and the rich relationship that exists between the blacks and the Jews in the United States is lost. And so I want to try in a very superficial way, admittedly, but to give us a little setting of, as we reconsider civil rights, to think about what led into that very historic period of the 1950s and 60s. And I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. So I think it's important to begin with the topic of slavery. And one of the most perplexing topics that I can't really fully explain, it's almost inexplicable, is how a people, I'm now speaking about the Jewish people, for whom the theme of slavery is such a central and important idea, how it is that in the United States of America there were Jews who participated in American slavery, particularly in the South, but not exclusively. And I brought a document, this is from 1794, this is the early national period. This is a harsh document to begin with, but we're in a rush. And you're looking at the writing of a man by the name of Abraham Seixas. Seixas from a very distinguished, pioneering Jewish family. The Seixas brothers, the children named Seixas, lived in numerous places, and one of the brothers lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And he was clearly a store owner. And what you're looking at is an early form of advertising. He took this out in a newspaper, and it's a rhyme. And what you see, of course, is Abraham Seixas, also gracious, once again his offer, his service is pure, for to secure money in the coffer. He has for sale some Negroes male, will suit full, well grooms. He likewise has some of their wives, can make clean dirty rooms. It goes on and on. It's what you have here is evidence, in not just in the South. There's also evidence in the North. Jews participated in the American slave system. There were Jews who fought for the Confederacy. There were Jews in the Confederate cabinet. And I'm often asked, what were the Jews in the South thinking on Passover when they were having their seders and they're rehearsing how they were freed from Egypt, and then they have their servants come in to serve them? What could they have been thinking? This is a complicated question. But just as I begin with this reality, because we have to talk, in my opinion, the truth about history, not to just talk about one side, there's also a very remarkable story of bonding and connectedness between the African American community and the Jews. This even appears in the slave period, when many Jews will, in their wills, manumit their slaves. That's a $25 word for set them free. And Jews, it's been established that more Jews per capita, meaning by rate, proportionately, were setting free in their will African Americans and their children than the general white population. Now, there was a period of time in the South after which you couldn't do this anymore. It becomes against the law to manumit your slaves. But we have some very remarkable documents I can't show you today of some touching, very touching last wills and testaments written by Jews in the 1830s, 1820s. One in 1809 that I'm thinking about, manumitting slaves so that after they die, they're provided for and set free. Now, here's an interesting story, also from the pre-Civil War period. You're looking at a man by the name of Joseph Friedman. This is a Cincinnati Jew. And Mr. Friedman had a brother named Abraham. And these two boys had a business in Alabama. And so, although they lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, in fact, this man was one of the leaders of the Jewish community. He will be Rabbi Berman. He becomes Benson. Rabbi Benson. He becomes a president of the Rockdale Temple in Cincinnati, and they have a business in Alabama, and so one of the brothers always has to go down to Alabama to run this business. And in 1849, Mr. Friedman, Joseph Friedman, the man you're looking at, he meets this man, Peter Still. Now, Peter Still is a slave, but Peter Still wants to purchase his freedom. So he is doing some work at that time, Mr. Still is, for a man who owns him and has sent him to have contact with this Jew from Cincinnati. And he senses, still does, that this Jew might be sensitive to his plight. Maybe he knows the Bible, and he knows about the Hebrews, who knows? But he approaches Mr. Still. Mr. Still approaches Mr. Friedman and basically says to him, I would like to purchase my freedom, but I have no money. So I want you to lend me money so that I can buy my freedom, and I will pay you back. Now this is, how many of you would do this? This is a complete stranger, and for some reason, there's this connection between these two men, and Friedman does this. And if you come to Cincinnati to the American Jewish Archives, which I'm privileged to direct, I'll actually show you letters between these two men. It's a this man goes on, still, he becomes a part of a remarkable story. His life story is published in a book called The Kidnapped and the Ransomed, in which he retells later on his whole story. He ends up in Philadelphia. He becomes a free man, and believe it or not, it's a magnificent story that he dictated and was written later on. He actually meets his brother and his mother after 49 years because they were free earlier and they lost contact. And it's only much later, after many years of being a free man, that they stumble into each other in Philadelphia. This whole story is recounted in a book that was published in 1856. So what you have happening is, during the Civil War, you have the same thing. You have Jews, as I told you already, who will fight for the Confederacy, who are fighting in part for slavery to preserve that kind of life. But then you have outspoken rabbis. This is a man from Chicago, a rabbi named Felsenthal, and they speak out against slavery. Some of the remarkable part of this is that many of these are immigrant Jews who've come from Central Europe. And so they immediately whether in the North or the South, they get involved in American culture and they speak out and participate. And here's a quote. This has been translated from German. I translated it from the German for you. And he writes in his paper, which reaches thousands of German Jewish immigrants, he says, if anyone above everyone, the Jew should nurture the most simmering and irreconcilable hatred of the curious institution of the South, and make the word fiat justitia, priat mundus, justice, that's Latin, justice, and if the world goes down, meaning no matter what, you have to have justice above everything else, he says, and this should be the Jew's motto. Here's a fascinating incident to show you this relationship. You're looking at an article from 1868. This is after the Civil War. This is during the Reconstruction period, and it takes place, as you can see, in Franklin, Tennessee. I'll blow it up for you. You can't read the whole thing, but you see the man in the first line. His name is Bierfield. He's a German Jewish immigrant, and he's a store owner in a place called Franklin, Tennessee. It's about 2 hours from Cincinnati. And Bierfield hires a free black man to be his clerk. And what you're looking at is a whole story, is this double murder, that these two people are murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in 1868 together. Why? Because they are opposed to any white man who is giving black man equality. They're fighting against the ideals of the Reconstruction, in other words, the victory of the North. And this makes stories, this particular story is circulated all over Jewish newspapers, that a Jewish man and a black man were killed together, the store owner and his clerk, because these bigots were against this equality that comes after the Civil War, only short-lived, of course. Now, these are quotes that I'm bringing you from black newspapers. And I bring them because it's very important to see that blacks begin to see, even in the 19th century, that if there's any white person who's likely to be sympathetic to the bigotry they suffer, it's probably going to be the Jew. Here's a quote from a black paper called the National Principia from 1860. This is during the Civil War. He says, with the exception of the Jews, under the whole heavens there is not to be found a people pursued with more relentless prejudice and persecution than are the free colored people of the United States. Here's another one. This is from 1889, so several decades after the Civil War. There is similarity between the Jew and the Negro. One is despised almost as much as the other. So you see that it's not just one way. The African American begins to see that, the Jew suffers oppression, and so they have something in common. Both of these conflicting realities exist at the same time. You have bigotry of the Jew towards the African American. If I had more time, I could show you bigotry of the African American towards the Jew. But at the same time, you have examples of growing awareness that these people suffer a common understanding of prejudice. Now, here's where we start to lead towards Jewish activity in terms of activating civil rights work for the African American. Jews in the United States become very concerned about the kind of bigotry and oppression that befalls their people in places like Poland and Russia, where Jews are brutalized. And famous, what was called pogroms or riots, take place in Russia. One of the most famous, it's hard to believe today, we think about the Holocaust, where millions of people were murdered. This is a famous riot where about 63 Jews, men, women, and children, were brutally beaten and killed. And that was considered one of the most horrific events in all Jewish history, that 63 people were murdered. And in light of what happened, of course, in World War II, it's hard to imagine that. But this made news all over the world, and Jews in America were very distressed about this. And they're publishing it, and they're trying to get the United States government to speak out and to talk to the Tsar and to try to contain this. And what's happening in America at the very same time that Jews are so upset about what's happening to their brothers over the across the ocean is the rise in lynchings for the African American. I just bring you one example, but I could show you a whole series of famous riots and lynchings that take place. This really takes off in the early 20th century. What am I saying? Quickly, I'm rushing. What am I saying is that at the time that Jews are becoming aware and upset in the United States about the bigotry that's befalling their people through cruelty and riots in Europe, they can't help but see what Americans are doing to blacks. And this pushes them to action. What's the action? You're looking at the committee that calls for an organization to become one of the most important civil rights organizations in the history of the United States, called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It doesn't just spring to life all by itself. There's a call for the need for this, and it's a direct result of one particular riot, but a whole series of these riots that occur. And I'm now going to blow up the committee that actually writes and calls for the creation of this organization, which they believe is necessary in America in order to advance the cause of righteousness in terms of behaving towards the black American. And I'm blowing up the names, and you're going to see these are largely New York, wealthy, liberal whites. But on that list, I'm pointing out a very famous rabbi named Dr. Stephen Wise of New York. And Stephen Wise becomes very good friends, close associates with one of the most key figures in the early development of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, forgive me. Let's see what I've got going here. As we get towards the 1930s, and Hitler comes to power, and there's bigotry in the United States toward the Jew, and Jews are reading all about what Hitler is doing in the 1930s leading up to World War II, the African American is taking note of the irony of the fact that Americans are publicizing the cruel behavior of the Nazis towards Jews, whereas in America they tolerate that very same behavior towards the black man. These are quotes from black newspapers 50, 60 years after the quotes I showed you. Look at the first one. It's from the Oklahoma City Black Dispatch. Why shed crocodile tears over the fate of the Jews in Berlin when here in America we treat black folk in the same manner every day? Why the comparison is so definite and clear, we are almost want to feel Germans secured the pattern of Nazi violence visited upon the Jews from white America. In other words, it almost looks as though the way the Nazis treat the Jews is the way the Americans treat the blacks. What's the big surprise? These are from black newspapers. Segregating Jews in Germany was, quote, taking a leaf from the book of many American cities, says the Cincinnati Union, the black newspaper. These are all from black newspapers. What I'm saying is blacks are raising the point at this time. Black activists, they're not saying what's going on in Nazi Germany is good and is just. They're saying, how can Americans criticize what's going on in Europe when the same behavior is being pointed towards the black man in the United States? I'm going to go through these. There's more of them. Now I'm going to bring you some remarkable documents. I want to make sure I keep within my time. I see I'm running out of time. So I hope all of you know, I had to read this in high school. How many of you have read Richard Wright's famous book, Native Son? Few of you have. Okay. I have to just quickly tell you the story because otherwise you won't appreciate the clip that's coming. Richard Wright, of course, is one of the 20th century's great novelist. Obviously, as you can see, he's an African American, and he writes a story that becomes a bestseller in 1940. The name, Native Son. It focuses on a main character by the name of Bigger Thomas. Bigger Thomas is an African American, a black man who suffers all sorts of disadvantages because of the environment in which he's raised in America, the disabilities that he's forced to engage with. And I'm rushing through the story, but in the story, he's going to rob a woman. The woman breaks into the house where he's robbing this woman, and she screams when she sees him. She gets frightened, and he wants to make her quiet, so he brings out a pillow and he pushes it onto her face to make her stop screaming, and he ends up killing her. So he goes to jail. And now he goes on trial, and the public defense that he's given, again, this is all created by Richard Wright, he's given a Jewish lawyer. The black playwright assigns this character a Jewish lawyer to defend him. And the Jewish lawyer says in the book, these famous words, he says to a colleague, he says, they're going to hang this man. He has no hope, even though I'm going to do the best to defend him. Why? Because they've given him a Jewish lawyer to defend him. And if there's anyone who is hated as much as this black man, it's this Jewish lawyer. Now, you remember I showed you the name of Stephen Wise, who was one of the founders of it called for the NAACP. So Wise now is a pretty elderly man, but he is a very important, prominent rabbi in New York, very dominant and very well known. And he gives, at services, he delivers a review of this book. That's what rabbis sometimes do. They read books, they tell their congregants, what's in the book and why they should read it and why it's important. Now I want you to listen carefully to this little selection that Rabbi Wise, delivers in 1940. This is 14 years before Brown versus Board of Education, 14 years before the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. Listen to what this rabbi says to 3,500 congregants who are listening to him in May of 1940.
To me, as I read Native Son, the word and the mind and the understanding and compassionate soul of the Jewish lawyer became to me at one and the same time symbol, rebuke, prophecy, challenge. Symbol of what the Jew should be and do in relation to other races that are oppressed and ground into the dust. And I remember the very sage and shrewd observation personally made to me a generation ago by Israel Zengel, and repeated in one of his last volumes. If only the Jews could forget their own fate, however bitter, and remember and try to better the fate of another, some alien race, such as the Negro race. After all, we Jews, as no other people, we know the heart of the oppressed. I can't help saying to you, if there be any Jews in this congregation today who hail from the South, they are likely profoundly to disagree with me, but I must speak the truth as I see it. The indifference of the Jew child of 35 centuries of civilization his own. The indifference of the Jew throughout the country, save for rarest exceptions, to the fate of the Negro race is deeply dishonoring to the Jew. I feel a double obligation to every oppressed race and to every wronged man on earth. For I am an American and I am a Jew. All I can say to you as I close is this. The time is come, in part as a result of the writing of this extraordinary indictment of the white race in its study of abnormal criminality. The time is come for Americans to bethink themselves, to think through and over again the whole problem of relations. And I suppose I can't help feeling, what if others fail? What if Christians fail? What if Catholic and Protestant churches fail? Must we fail because they do? Must our Judaism remain a mockery and a pretense? Even if it be true that Christianity, Christendom has suffered oceanic and even infinite wrong, to be laid upon the body and the soul of the Negro race.
This is a very rich clip. There's a lot to say about it, but I'm gotta move quickly. But if you listen to it, first of all, he says, if there are Jews from the South in this congregation, you're not going to like what I have to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. And then he says, normally I would draw this out, but we're in a hurry. So, like at the end when he says, what if Christianity fails? What if Protestantism fails? Must we fail? What he's dealing with here is what he's really saying is, people have already said to me, Jews have said to me, Rabbi, why are you talking to us like this? They hate us. Let the Protestants lead the way. Let the other religions lead the way. We're a minority. Why do we have to get involved in this? And that's his answer. His answer is, it doesn't matter to me what the others do. We have to be self-respecting. This is what our religion calls upon us to do. So now, very quickly, and then I'll draw it to an end, and maybe at the end I can show you a few other things. But once the Holocaust occurs, you see what I've tried to show you is there's been this back and forth, the relationship for over 150 years, where yes, Jews were involved in the oppression of blacks, but also Jews were very involved and increasingly aware of the unfairness of what had happened. And you have this binary activity going on at the same time. And in the 20th century, Jews become more keenly aware. And you see the evidence of it. I've just given you one or two examples that just as Jews are mistreated, so are blacks. And then blacks even point it out and say, look, what's happening to us is what's happened to you. And so once the Holocaust occurs, and very simply, the Jews really realize that what really kills all those people is they're ground to dust between two big millstones. On the one hand is the apathy of the whole world, and the other is the bestial cruelty of the Nazis. And the Jews, millions of European Jews, are just ground to dust and no one does anything. They sit by quietly. That recognition that hits the American Jew, which the American Jew becomes the largest Jewish community after World War II in the world, suddenly, because European Jewry is destroyed. And now that Jewish community, which was free from that bigotry, in other words, the Jewish community of America didn't suffer the way the European Jewish community. They say to themselves, we can't let that happen ever again. And that notion, that the fact that everyone was quiet, and that's what resulted in our destruction, that is probably the primary motivating factor to drive Jews so actively into the civil rights period in the 1950s. That's probably the key stimulus. The recognition of what had happened in Europe, and therefore in America, we can't let that happen to anybody else. Then that's probably one of the reasons why. Now, I only want to show you, because I'm out of time, but I want to show you one remarkable phenomenon, because one of the hardest places for Jews to advocate for the African American was in the Deep South. Now, some of you may not have heard this, but maybe some of the old people like me will remember it.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss it gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
This is Governor George Wallace of Alabama. That's his inaugural address in 1963 on the courthouse steps in Montgomery. And what happens, that I just want to end with this, and then is that the next day, this man, a rabbi in Birmingham, Alabama, who's a northerner, but has been in Birmingham for about 10 years, this man puts his name to a petition. This petition you're going to look at is called the White Minister's Law and Order Statement. It comes out a couple of days after the governor makes this big statement. And 12 clergy people sign their name to it, and you can see for yourself, I think I circle it here, of the 12, 2 are rabbis. Now, if you think that that is approximately the proportion of Jews in the state of Alabama to the clergy, you're wrong. This is a very high percentage of Jewish clergy in this listing. And I didn't bring you the whole statement, but it's a famous statement. It's been published in books because it's believed to be the first time that a public statement by white ministers was made in opposition to segregation. And they gently, very gently, prod the governor and say, we wish, they do it politely as they can, we wish